Our next panel is Evolution of a Space Policy, How to Achieve Consensus. Our moderator is Frank Mooring, who I know all of you know, but I'm going to say a few things anyway, okay? He's senior editor at Aviation Week and Space Technology and has been a journalist for 40 years, specializing in aerospace for over 20 years. He joined Aviation Week in 1989 as a defense space reporter and senior space technology editor. He began his career working for his hometown daily in Huntsville, Alabama, and moved to Washington in 1979 as correspondent for the Birmingham Post-Herald. He later covered the Cold War Pentagon for Scripps Howard News Service. Please join me in welcoming Frank.
Thank you, Lynn. And why don't the rest of the panel just come on up and we'll get started. I'm going to try to keep this kind of informal if we can and do questions and answers, and I hope that y'all have lots of them. You know, it's a leap year. I guess y'all noticed a couple of weeks ago that we got an extra day. And of course that means that it's time for the Summer Olympics and also for the presidential elections. You probably heard about that too. And you know, presidential politics all tend to overwhelm the broader elections. This year there's all the seats in the House, a third of the Senate, and about a dozen governor's mansions are also up. And as usual, space exploration is not really getting a whole lot of attention right now in the broader political environment. And that's, to me, that's kind of surprising. You know, space, by one count, is a $330 billion a year industry internationally. That's a lot of money, I think. I'm not sure. You know, there are hundreds of thousands of people, including, I suspect, practically everybody in this room, including me, who make their living from the space program. And so it's important to us. The fact that it wasn't a big deal, it isn't a big deal now, isn't that unusual either. I think we can all remember 8 years ago that it also didn't really come up on the map in the debates leading into the current presidential administration and all the other offices that went along with it. And the difference, I think, this year and 8 years ago is probably one of tone. I think before it was issues of the economy, war and peace, and now it has to do with, if I may, the size of body parts. So that's a shame, I think. But the U.S. space program, by extension that of much of the rest of the world, given the relative size of the U.S. space economy, is just getting into some really interesting places. Some really exciting new stuff is going on. And it's kind of shaken out, and things are happening that a lot of people, and some of them sitting at this table, I think would like to see continue. There's a clear understanding among many in the space community, industry, advocates, interested citizens who are sometimes dismissed as enthusiasts, but they are taxpayers, that another reset of the space policy that we've sort of evolved into could be disastrous. Earlier this month, there was about a baker's dozen very disparate space groups who got together and called for a more coherent transition, maybe a way to put it. And one of those groups was the AAS, the American Astronautical Society, and they gave this panel the title, Evolution of a Space Policy, How to Achieve Consensus. And you know, I'm not sure that there's a complete consensus today. I think there's probably more of one today than there was a while back. It has evolved, and what I would like to do is, in the next hour and a half or so, to talk about how that consensus can be refined, evolved, and continue without a dramatic disruption, if in fact that's what the space community wants. We have a really sterling panel to address these issues. and you know all of them, but I'm going to introduce them a little bit. Marcia Smith, right here on my left, is the president of the Space and Technology Policy Group and editor of the invaluable website spacepolicyonline.com, which I look at every single day. And I've trusted Marcia as an honest broker in space policy issues since the 1970s. I started calling her when I was still working in Alabama. And back in those days, she was advising lawmakers and tutoring ignorant reporters like me for the Congressional Research Service. Lori Garver needs no introduction, I'm sure. She's the general manager of the Airline Pilots Association, but we all know her as President Obama's deputy NASA administrator and the point person for the policy changes that issued from his White House. I think that's fair. Lori was certainly the one that I covered when I was writing about those changes. She's been a Washington-based policy, space policy, I have the word wonk here, I'll say expert instead. Maven. I like it too. So our Maven, since the early 80s, she served as executive director of the National Space Society for 9 years. She advised Hillary Clinton on space issues before the 2008 elections and has worked space policy on President Obama's transition team. Chris Shank, next down the row, is the policy director for the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee and a key advisor to the committee's chairman, Representative Lamar Smith of Texas. He was director of strategic investments at NASA and special assistant to Administrator Michael Griffin on human spaceflight and earth science issues. And like Lori, he's played a key role in formulating U.S. space policy at NASA and on the Hill. And he's also a former Air Force officer with duty time in the Pentagon, NRO, and the Air Force Space Command. Sandy Magnus, next down, is executive director of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics and a 3-time space shuttle astronaut. She spent 4.5 months on the space station as a member of Expedition 18 in 2008-2009. And as such, she was off the planet during the early transition from President George W. Bush's space policy to the current policy under President Obama. She's taken a very proactive role at AIAA in ensuring that space professionals are represented, that the space professionals represented by AIAA have a strong voice in the transition ahead. And finally, last but not least, Mary Lynn Dittmar is the executive director of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, which is an industry group set up to promote U.S. space leadership. She has a long career as a consultant to defense, aerospace, and technology companies on public-private partnership, strategy, and outreach. She was a member of the National Research Council Committee for Human Spaceflight, and as such, she helped draft the NRC's Pathways to Exploration report in 2014. So as you can see, the panel's well qualified to explore what it will take to evolve the space policy we have today into the future with minimum disruption, I hope, from the shifts in the broader political priorities as they evolve through the decades ahead. I'd like for this to be a discussion, as I said, so I'm going to ask some questions, but I really hope you guys do, because I don't have enough to fill up an hour and a half, no matter how long these guys talk. And with that, I'm going to kick it off with Sandy. And you were part of the group the coalition of groups that talked about the need for a smooth transition and to get the space policy issues into the election at some level. I wonder if you could walk us through the motivation behind that work, give us an idea of how hard it was to reach agreement among those groups, and tell us how you and your colleagues hope to proceed in this election year.
Yeah, so it all started last summer, I guess. I don't remember the exact month, but the Space Foundation, AAS, AIAA, AIA, and pardon me, CSF. Sorry, I'm like totally losing my mind here after lunch. We all started talking together and about the election, because we all worry about transitions. If you look at the history of the space program, especially, it seems like every 2, 4, or 6 years there's another turn in the road where we're going this way and then we're going that way, then we're going this way, and that's, as you know, not healthy for us, because we need long-term commitments. We need a plan that spans more than 2 or 4 or 6 years. and looking around the industry and looking at all the great things that are coming to fruition now after many years of a lot of work so in the back rooms, and we know there's been a lot of hard work going on. We are the people who are doing the work. We know the engineering is coming to fruition. We know the manufacturing is coming to fruition. We know we're about to enter into this really exciting phase where there are things launching all over the place, which is really when the rest of the world tends to pay attention to what's going on in space, is when you have a lot of things launching. And so knowing that there was some great momentum out there and the difficulties that can come with the transition, we really got together to see if we could find across this very broad group of people and organizations, even though we had some overlapping members amongst all 5 of us, it really our membership spanned the whole industry. If we could as a group of 5 dispersed organizations find some intersection, the intersection of the Venn diagram, if you will, where we all agreed on things that were important to continue or points that we wanted to make that were important about the space program, that we could present as a broad coalition, inviting other groups in as we got the basics set. If we could do that and show there was a broad consensus from the community about, hey, this is really what we think is important about space. This is a really broad consensus from industry about what's really important about space, that it would minimize the disruptions of a transition, it would emphasize the great momentum going on in the industry, and it would almost create enough inertia that for a candidate coming in, whether it's in Congress or the administration, that it would be almost harder to fight, because this is not something they tend to care about anyway. I mean, let's face it. And so it's like almost like de facto, hey, all these people think this is all good stuff, so let's just maybe not make this a huge issue, and let's just let this stuff continue. And then with that momentum, as the community starts to really show what we can do with the launches, which of course we know we're already doing all these great things, but we can show with these launches coming up and with these milestones that people are starting to hit, that this momentum would continue the program forward, and we wouldn't be subject to some of this left turn, right turn, left turn, right turn, let's blow up and reset and waste a lot of time and money and energy that everyone's put into the things that they're already doing. So that's really where the conversation started. So we got together, and it was not easy. It was not easy along the way. We have, again, a very diverse set of communities that we all represent. We found that we had communication lines that perhaps weren't great inside of our own communities, because there's a lot of people who are very enthusiastic and passionate about space. And we worked through it very slowly. It took months and months and months. We had setbacks. It was almost like a 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Okay, wait, we got to make sure these people come in and these people come in, and people got angry, and people stuck with it, though. We all stuck with it, and we came up with the paper that we released last week. We ended up with, I think, 12 or 13 communities that signed on. Hopefully more will sign on as well. But the whole idea, again, is to really kind of show that the communities come around a set of ideas that we think are important. We're very excited about the work that's going on. We want the momentum to continue. We don't want disruption at this point when we're so close to the fruition of some of these programs that are out there, and that really was the genesis. I think we all kind of went into it with the attitude that we should not be talking about an either or an or in the context of space, that it's an and that there's, I kind of think about it, and this is how I explained it when we were doing the press conference last week, is, that explaining our endeavors in space as a community is sort of this expanding bubble off the surface of the planet, where there's a role for governmental investment in keeping that bubble expanding ever outward. And if you do it right, and if it's done over time, that technology infuses into the industry, that fundamental knowledge base infuses across the community. And for example, there are college students launching small sats. How many of us in the room could have imagined in college that we would be able to launch, not only build small sats, launch small sats, have a control center in your basement of your university building where you're controlling your small sats? I mean, that has a lot to do with 50 years of knowledge that's been accumulated by the people in this room and our predecessors. The fact that technology is advanced to the extent that that's accessible to people, the fact that there are some people with lots of money out there who think they understand the risk-reward equation enough to venture investment into doing new and interesting things in space that maybe aren't as governmental investment based, and then the government's willing to kind of let that play. So this is all possible because of 50 years of government leading the way and doing the investments in the hard stuff. So you need that edge of the bubble, but if you do it right over time, and it takes a long time because what we do is hard, you know, 50 years later, we're at that point where we're starting to realize some of the benefits as a society, and we want that momentum to continue, and that momentum has to continue on both the fronts, where you're expanding the governmental bubble of investment to feed the technologies in for the next few decades, and you want to bring everybody else who wants to do some non-governmental based activities behind you. And so we're at this time of transition where this bubble's finally getting off the surface of the planet, and then the edge of the bubble's finally getting beyond low Earth orbit, and it might take us another 10 or 15 years to continue this transition. It's not easy, but you know, because it took us 50 years to get here, 48 or 45, depending on when you count do the countdown clock. So we have some good momentum going on, and you know, this constant left-right zigzag is bad for us, and it breaks that momentum up, and it wastes resources. And so that's really the sort of the genesis of the conversations that we had that made us work together and helped us to get through this. So I'll stop there, and I can take questions later.
Any questions now? Okay. Marcia and I have talked some about the questions of achieving and sustaining consensus, and I wonder if you would give us your take on how to do that.
So the title of the panel discussion is how to achieve consensus, but achieving consensus is only half the battle. You then have to sustain the consensus, and that can be just as hard, but it's just as critical that you do that. And so I thought about this more broadly than just human spaceflight. So in the Earth and space science communities, you achieve consensus through the decadal survey process that's run by the national academies, and Ken Sembeck was talking about some of that earlier for the astrophysics discipline, but they do that now for all the various disciplines. So there is a mechanism for achieving consensus within the scientific community that by and large the political community agrees with, and they try to follow it as best they can. So that's how you achieve consensus, and you sustain consensus pretty much through peer pressure. You have a very prominent person who's run the decadal and has a lot of influence in the community, and they try to keep things all together during that decade. It works well sometimes, not so well other times, and a determined scientist and sometimes a politician can find a way how to circumvent a decadal survey, but by and large, I think the decadal survey process is pretty good at both achieving and sustaining consensus for the space and earth science communities. So what happens in human spaceflight? In human spaceflight, it's much more of a political process. And in modern times, since Apollo, it's really been a different process for each of the human spaceflight programs, Space Shuttle, Space Station, and the quest to send people back to the moon and on to Mars. For all those who bemoan the fact that you can't keep these big human spaceflight programs going through different presidential transitions, I like to point out that we did do that for Shuttle and Station. The Space Shuttle started with President Nixon, and it ended with President Obama, which was 8 presidents. The Space Station began with President Reagan. It's still going on today, and it's going to be going on presumably past whoever gets elected in November, so it's 5 presidents and counting. So it is possible to keep big, expensive human spaceflight programs going through various presidential transitions. It's not easy to do, and there are perturbations along the way because new presidents do like to put their imprint on programs, so there have been changes, especially at the space station as presidents have come and gone. And I have to just note that 2 of the big changes came with President Clinton and President George W. Bush, and they were at least partially in response to big overruns that NASA chose to announce just as those new presidents were taking office. And it might be a good idea that if you're going to have an overrun, don't announce it just when the new guy's walking in the door. Not that there's ever a good time to announce a big overrun, but probably not when a new guy's just about to be deciding your fate. But in any case, the space station did survive those perturbations. It did change quite a bit in those administrations, but you did have the sustainability. The programs kept going. So the one that all of us worry about today is, of course, the Humans to Mars program, or just the Future Human Spaceflight program. And in a sense, there has been a consensus for decades on that program. The first, I'll call it a formal document that came out about sending humans to Mars was in 1969, the post-Apollo program that came out of the Space Task Group, chaired by then Vice President Agnew, the Agnew Report. and it said that the long-term goal should be going to Mars. Nothing much came of it. President George H.W. Bush had a big speech at the National Air and Space Museum in 1989, let's go to Mars. Nothing much came of it. President George W. Bush gave a speech, let's go to Mars. And for 5 years, there was a consensus on that. You did have a consensus, but the consensus was not sustained. And there are 2 experts on this panel and a couple in the audience who can speak with much more authority than I can as to why that consensus was not sustained. And so now, where are we today? In 2016, we're sort of back to having the long-term goal, what Mary Lynn's committee called the horizon goal of landing people on Mars at some point, and the debate is still over all the steps in between. So we still have to reach a consensus on the steps in between, and we have to sustain the consensus on the steps in between, and I think that that will be the challenge. I hope only for this new administration and not for administrations after that, because it would be nice to actually make an agreement and stick to it.
Marcia, questions? You know, Laurie, what was it, 2-3 years ago, I wrote a profile of you for our Person of the Year feature, which is usually one person who's an airplane guy, and then the runner-up from the space program, who had a big influence on things, and I think we credited you properly with having changed the direction of or had a big role in changing the direction of the ocean liner or the oil tanker. And, you know, well, there was a hearing in the House Science Committee, week before last week, where it's clear that there's still some hard feelings from that abrupt transition, the termination of the Constellation program, I think, primarily. And, you know, I have to just ask you if, at this juncture, at this distance, and also with the possibility that you may be in this situation again, I'm just saying, just guessing, you know, is there anything that you would do differently? Are there lessons that you learned from your experience the first time? What would you do differently?
Thanks, Frank. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. I am very aware when we came in that there are things we could have done that would have made what we did easier in some ways. I would say, however, most importantly, to Marcia's point of having, being able to achieve consensus and sustain it, the most important thing is to have a program that's worthwhile, makes sense, and is able to be funded well enough to deliver. So when transitions come in, they do. I think this is a great title for our panel because it's on evolution, and if this were evolution, I guess I'm considered the asteroid that came in for disruption, as Sandy said. They want to minimize disruption, and any of the difficulties that came from transition, having more coherent transition. Well, I would argue that whether or not I would say, first of all, I'm a meteorite at best, no asteroid. This is not a very changed program from 8 years ago at NASA. Certainly the majority of what NASA was involved in those days continued on so many fronts. But also, I think how you view something like an asteroid hit depends on whether you're a dinosaur or a furry mammal. And in fact, I do have some furry mammal friends out there, thank you very much, and lots of dinosaurs who are evolving and doing great things and managing just fine in the new world. I think for the transition almost 8 years ago, 7 years ago, you have to think about what we were inheriting. And I disagree a little with don't announce an overrun right before they come. Don't wait to let them uncover it. I mean, so that's what happened. You come in and your job for 3 months is to find out everything you can that's actually going on to inform the next president about the most important things to go forward. Our reports were weekly. We were focused on each transition across every agency. What needs to be done in your agency in the first 100 days? What needs to be done at your agency in the first year? and what needs to be done first term. We focused on those things like a laser. We got in everybody we could to tell us everything they were willing to tell us, to give the president and whoever he was going to nominate and have run the agency when they came in, have as much information as possible. If we had not made changes in transition, we would not have had the last 2 shuttle flights. My dear colleague here, Sandy, wouldn't have gotten to go on that last flight. Those flights were not funded. AMS would not be on the space station delivering science. We would not have the space station anymore. It was going to be deorbited by 2015. Orion, at its earliest, was going to come in 2017 and have nowhere to go. Cargo flights, much less crew flights on commercial vehicles, would have had no reason to exist without the anchor tenant of space station continuing, and we wouldn't have yet been able to even start on heavy lift development because we weren't going to be able to fund that or the lunar lander before deorbiting station. Webb, we found out, had $1 billion overrun. In transition, Charles Alachi came to me and said he had a $400 million shortage in MSL and needed a 2-year delay. I mean, these were things that we stepped up to the plate to solve in a way that I understand was very disruptive. And in evolution, sometimes you have disruptions. And so for me, the lessons learned would be have programs that are on track, worthwhile, and make sense. And if you feel you have that now, you have very little to be concerned about in a transition, because I think this community, you know, we have a belief that our programs are the most valuable things out there, but they do get weighed in the broader context. Regarding the white paper, to me, though, I have been involved in those since Dukakis, and you've got to do them, and they're great to do, and I'm thrilled I didn't have to do it again. Probably done them every 4 years for 30 years. And having been on the receiving end in campaigns of those, they are, I think, worthwhile, but keep in mind, you know, it's like the energy community getting together and saying we want this for your energy policy, you know, or agriculture. When it comes from the own community, it is a bit self-serving, and when you're asking for everything, it is harder to be able to have it be meaningful. That would be my advice on papers like that. For me, the number one thing I would have done differently, and Chris and I have talked about this before, early on in the transition, when we went to the Hill to talk about the NASA program and what needed to be done, there was a lot of common recognition about the problems with Constellation, about the problems with station deorbiting without Ares 1 being there yet, about its overruns. The costs were already out of control with a lot of slips and it being very early in the program. So I would have had the Hill do the review rather than the administration if I had it to do over. We considered it, the appropriators were on board, and we just decided for expediency, since everybody agreed, we'd have the administration do it. But Democrats were in charge of both the House and the Senate, and this was, in those days, if you recall, appropriators, it was before the authorizers really and appropriators started working so closely together. Were on board. I think that would have made a huge difference, because part of the problem was when that study came out, it wasn't yet in the budget, so it was all pre-decisional, which didn't allow us to talk to the Hill in any significant advanced way, which made it very poorly received. However, I definitely recognize, no matter how well you rolled out a hundreds of billions of dollar program, getting canceled is not going to be received well. And we absolutely could have rolled it out better, but for people who just didn't want it canceled, that you're not going to be able to do better.
Thanks, Lori. Questions? Here. Can you use the mic, please?
Are there any statistics on the number of women in the space program?
Sure. Statistics, definitely. I tell you, there's a lot more than there are in commercial aviation. those guys are just so tired of me on this issue. I said, even our last astronaut class was 50-50. How many percentage of women commercial airline pilots do you think there are? 5%. That's just unbelievable. So, space is doing great. In many of the most, I think, the engineering fields in the 20%. Turns out we're 50% of the population, however. So, it's all relative. Most women are going in, when they go into STEM, in the biological sciences more than engineering, and that's what we really, I think, need to connect more what we do in engineering as well as in the space program with providing real benefits and value to the public, because those are the fields where women really like to focus.
Chris, I told you I wasn't going to sandbag you, but I'm sorry, you go ahead. Yeah.
Because I think Lori hit on some important points. So let me talk about that from the NASA experience. And the player that has not been named in this transition process is the Office of Management and Budget's role in this. She identified a laundry list there of programs where the White House decided, and it was communicated to NASA to the agency that certain decisions would be made by the next administration, not by this administration. And some of those were what to do with the 2 additional shuttle flights, including flying the AMS, the initial need for cargo. That was seen as a new administration decision. Also, they said next administration would decide plutonium-238 production, not under the Bush administration. In terms of the cessation, was simply a 20, I think you said 2017, I thought it was more like 2015. 2015 was, that was seen as and was briefed to the Hill by NASA as simply for planning purposes of budget, and that would be revisited later. So that was a budget driven, and no one believed that, and everyone said that in terms of the communications. The James Webb Space Telescope, the $1 billion for that, NASA knew that, briefed OMB that information. I think because I was a political appointee, I made sure that I back-channeled that to my Hill counterparts so that there was no surprises from us. That's where, and it took a long time for the current administration to finally get around to identifying this, and due to the thanks of Senator Mikulski, actually, and Congressman Frank Wolf for helping getting folks' attention to the need to fix James Webb and get it on the right budget track. But that was well identified by folks within NASA and the folks at Goddard. You knew that there was a problem that needed to be worked in the budget. MSL, I think that was well known. Also that there was a schedule delay. I don't have your full laundry list, but I think the main point is in a transition period for folks to maintain their integrity and and Lori is exactly right, be forthcoming about it. And I tried to maintain that, but again, just want to point out, the OMB decided not to go forward with letting both the public and the Hill know a number of things. So, especially on James Webb in particular, I had a great deal of consternation about that.
Questions?
Did I address your? Did I miss anything?
I was about to ask about that.
I could do this whole thing, so I don't want to just do back and forth. I do, being forthcoming is a point I do want to reinforce. NASA was not forthcoming with our incoming transition team, and that led to huge problems, not to mention my getting to be on Rachel Maddow. The decision of the then current NASA administrator to publicly make it clear he wanted to keep his job, didn't approve of us, the transition team, did not serve NASA well. The fact that for the Constellation program in particular, as we tried to get information, we were shut out. I was shown for Ares only a video, and it had 2 of them launching at the same time. It was fabulous. And I said, don't worry about this, it's great. I don't know if people thought there was going to be another election, but you know, my other point about transitions and being so concerned about disruption of transitions is, you know, we live in a great country that has a great thing called democracy. And in a democracy, when you are spending the public's money, you do get to elect the leaders who get to make decisions about how to use the public's money and distribute it. So this process that we in space sometimes want to be above is a great process. We just need to learn to live better within it. And for those things that happen to have other markets and can benefit from the other great thing about this country, capitalism, you can take those things out of the political system and therefore not be subject to the whims of the public and their voting. So, of course, the key would be for whoever is coming in an administration to work most closely with the Hill, because those are the two bodies who, if they work together, can make the government aspect of the program best. And I just would encourage you to not be as concerned about the tight grip, but making these programs the best they can be, and future administrations and congressional will want to support them.
Yeah, I think Lori might be conflating elections with law, as in authorization acts and appropriations acts, as opposed to the election itself, which is more of in the personnel. In terms of what needs to be followed, and legislation matters like that. There is, that is the direction in terms of the policy direction and the budget direction.
You know, I've studied this. Lots of people have. You get policy direction from both the administration and the Hill. I don't think most people consider it in the past to be the Hill. I mean, Kennedy's sort of known. Where's John Logsdon to tell us this? Followed by Lyndon Johnson. Obviously, Nixon canceled things. You know, large human spaceflight programs are geopolitical in nature. We already heard people refer to Clinton and Bush doing this or that. So it's I mean, I think you're seeing right now the problem. We're going to argue over who is in charge of it instead of trying to figure out, does your program make sense and can you get support for it in both? And in regards to your OMB comments, I can't really let that go either, because yes, OMB is part of the executive. Most of the people, as you know, making those decisions are not political appointees. These were not political people. They were the most forthcoming with us about information. They were thrilled to have us be able to help work through how we could have a budget that would allow station to continue, that would allow them to put in the 2 additional shuttle flights. Those were not in the budgets because of the priorities of the previous administration. And I absolutely recognize and respect the value of Congress to have the power of the purse. And if we work together, obviously it would go smoother.
In 1 second, I don't really want to get into this debate, but I was around then. And I was looking over the fence, you know, this is fascinating. Those of us who were trying to write about and understand and explain what was going on were kind of in the dark about a lot of the stuff that you're talking about right now. Some of it was out there, some of it wasn't. And particularly as we started getting around to the first Obama space budget, one of your colleagues from the transition appeared in the Rayburn building for what we call a plaque pass, where somebody was getting an award. And he was billed in advance as going to be there as present. So I and a bunch of my colleagues scurried up there to ask him questions about what was going on. And, you know, it was like we had just confronted Richard Nixon at one of the debates. I mean, he was sweating, and he walked away from us, and we called him back and said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I didn't know I was going to be ambushed by the press." He was standing in room 3125, the Senate, the House Rayburn building. 2325. It was kind of a public space where the press can go. And here's an important member of the administration on this issue who did not really expect to be held, and I don't want to get all up on the press high horse, but we were going to at least try to find out what was going on instead of maybe not hold him accountable, but just see what was happening. And there was, we were completely shut down. So I am going to use my moderator's prerogative and jump on Mary Lynn and sort of blindside her. Your job is to create consensus. And I think from what Sandy has said and Marcia, that one of the ways you do that is to try to get public support for the programs, good, bad, or indifferent, that we're talking about. Can you give us some idea of how you're going about that, how you would like to go about that? I know you're fairly new in this role.
First of all, I just want to say that this is awesome because it is a case in point for why it is so difficult to get consensus. And I mean it. I mean, I'm not putting anybody down. It's a great illustration of how difficult this is. And thanks. So that's my first thing. I think this is going to sound very trite, and I don't mean it to be that way, but maybe the very first step is to agree that developing consensus does not mean 100% agreement. It means a working agreement that allows you to go forward together in order to be able to meet common goals. So this morning there was a discussion about how you don't have to love your partner, you don't have to love your teammate, you just have to have shared mutual interest. And identifying what those interests are is sometimes by itself very, very difficult, because people have their own perspective on what those interests are. Sometimes they actually have exactly the same interest, but they're using such different language that they're talking past each other. So in this role, this coalition was an outgrowth of something that was called the Coalition for Space Exploration, and we renamed it Deep Space Exploration because we wanted to focus on that sort of outer edge of the bubble that Sandy was talking about, and expanded it to not just be talking about exploration, but also be talking about science, believing that exploration and science are both share a common heritage, and that heritage has to do with discovery. And they just have different methods for sort of engaging in that discovery. That may be the very first area in which we struggle with consensus within this organization, because those of you that have been in this game for a long time know that sometimes scientists and explorers, especially with regard to human spaceflight, they have not always been aligned. And they still aren't aligned. So where are the common interests? Well, part of it is just sort of find what those are and then discussing them and figuring out how it is that we can help each other and advance mutual interest. So this thing started again with 5 companies. Those 5 companies work together but don't always see eye to eye. In January, we had 5 companies. Now we have 35 companies. I'm shooting for 100 companies. I'll take more than that. But one of the common things that we all share together is that industry underlies everything that this country does, and actually everything that most countries do with regard to space exploration and science. Without industry, you wouldn't have space exploration and science programs. Not in this system, in the way that it's set up in this system. And so sometimes it just begins with really simple understandings like that, and a conviction that we're going to find consensus rather than shoot inward. And the reason I took this job is that my concern for a long time has been that as the community shoots inward, if I look at it from outside, I think, why in the world should I mess with it, $330 billion industry or not, if these people are spending more energy shooting inward, okay, than coming together and trying to go forward together, then why would I take them seriously? And I think that it's very important that we take this seriously, because I think space exploration and science are hallmarks of what make this country a great country.
Thanks, Mary Lynn. And I interrupted you. I'm sorry, you had a question.
Yep. So, thank you, though. We did want to hear from Mary Lynn. What challenges me, sorry, Steve Brody, ISU, good to see you all, is the human spaceflight program, which probably will be the lightning rod for discussion going into the next administration. Maybe there'll be others as well. I know Charlie this morning in our breakfast spoke heavily about, he wouldn't give up any one of his 4 children, so to speak, of aeronautics, technology, science, or human exploration. It wouldn't be, give me your #1 priority and everything else is down below. But as we talk about human exploration, how, and I really welcome the input, how do we portray, which hopefully is true, that an initiative to take humans to Mars is not just another Apollo boots on the ground? How do we portray it in a way, which hopefully is the case, that we're bringing humanity with us in many dimensions? In other words, commercial opportunities, expanding the ecosystem, so there's commercial opportunities going to the moon, there's other things going on, and that NASA's push towards Mars isn't just to plant the flag, and we don't really have a clear vision of what's beyond or embraced in that vision.
Thank you for that question. Any takers? I'll pick one. Sandy, this sounds a little bit like the bubble.
Back to, I think, some of the things that Marcia said about how to maintain your consensus.
It's on now.
Hello, there we go. I think it goes back to some of the things that Marcia was talking about when she talked about the fact that we really don't know how we're going to get, we all kind of have coalesced on Mars, it's the place we're going, and then how and the methodology is still very much a subject of great debate inside the community. But I go back to my bubble paradigm. It's like, if we do it the right way, first of all, we don't talk about going to Mars in the context of just going to Mars. We have to start talking about Mars in the context of things that we want to do when we get there. And that's not just go plant the flag, because I think that the setting up the expectation in the outside world about what Mars means is important. And we're just talking about going to Mars. That sets the expectation up. And the only paradigm that the outside the space industry world is, we're going to go to the moon. Well, we went to the moon, put a flag, and we're done with the moon, right? And that's not the paradigm we want people to think about when we talk about going to Mars. We want people to think about, we're going to go Mars, and we're going to do X, we're going to do Y, we're going to do Z, and then we're going to go, so we want to start as a community talking about it in that way, so that sets up the paradigm that we're presenting to the outside world, if you will, about what we want to do as a community there. And then the context, if you think about my expanding bubble paradigm, we have to figure out a way to go to Mars in such a way that we pull that non-governmental private investment along and make sure that we're creating opportunities for them, because we want that bubble of economic development that's not governmental based to expand off the planet as well. So I'll just throw this out there as a thought experiment. Why couldn't we test technology on the moon? The government needs to test the technology to go to Mars. We're doing a lot of technology development on the space station. That's a wonderful platform. There could be things that we need to test in our backyard, either in cislunar space or on the moon. And the government needs to lead the way there, because that's stuff we're still trying to figure out how to make, and there's some things that companies won't invest in because you can't make a profit off it, and that's what the government does, is invest in things you can't make a profit off of until it becomes commercially viable. So why couldn't we figure out a way to go do that in such a way that the government leads the way, we do the technology development, and bam, the government keeps expanding the bubble out to Mars, but then we've done it in such a way that we bring the private enterprises along behind us, and they're busy doing stuff on the moon after the bubble's expanded past them, right? So that requires a lot of thinking and a lot of thought. It requires a strategy that's bigger than just NASA. It requires almost a strategy that's, nationally, how do we want to invest in technology? Where do we want the owners of the technology to be, so that we can either spread it around the industry or it's invested in one company? What things nationally do we need to make sure we have for decades and decades, versus things that we can have industry lead, and so we're not as worried about if a company disappears or not? I mean, this is bigger than just NASA. So I think we have to start with that. And that's just my 2 cents. And so I'm sure somebody else has something.
Oops, okay.
You can hear, I have a loud voice. W. Bush and Cheney had a panel, and they had a program for what could NASA do, and they came up with moon, Mars, and beyond.
actually, probably Marcia would.
Comment that I think that Steve really has hit the nail on the head. It's not just how do you present it, it's that the community, that's all of you and all of us and everybody else that I know, really have not reached consensus on how to get to Mars. And Chris's committee had a hearing back in February or something, and there was a consensus that you needed to have a consensus, but no consensus on what the consensus should be. And so Sandy has just laid out a very logical, thoughtful program, and if I were an astronaut, that's exactly the way I would want the program to go. But there are other people who want to go back to the moon and then to Mars. Forget the whole moon thing, because that's a debate we've been having for 50 years, and I can hardly stand to have it again. But there's this new debate about how do you go to Mars. Do you go to the surface of Mars? Do you go to Mars orbit? Do you go to Phobos? And so there's a whole other layer of disagreement in the community as to what the plan should be. And if Frank doesn't mind, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, because Chris sent me a link earlier today about an op-ed, and it builds on Congressman Perlmutter's bumper sticker, Mars in 2033. So there is a cadre of people who want to set a date by which it needs to be done. And is that a flyby, or is that a Phobos mission? I didn't get to read the whole article. So, you know,
alignment, if you went out, it would only take it 1.5 years as opposed to 2 to 3 years.
right. So that's another option. So maybe you want to explain what that option is.
Yeah, this was studied, and this is where policy folks have to step back and let program managers, program types like Dan Dumbacher's of the world, the Doug Cooks of the world, take take ownership of here is the programmatic plan for those interim steps. One of the intriguing proposals that has been studied is a unique orbital alignment that mission designers out at JPL came upon in the 2011 timeframe, where it was where it said this is interesting how a flyby mission could occur with Mars in 2033. Now, between here and 2033 is a great deal is some white space, right? So but we know that we're going to be doing that we've got the space station, and it's outstanding. Scott Kelly coming back and testing and doing those tests of let's test this out for 1 year. Let's go further than that. But again, that's working out the mission designs, the EM1 mission, the EM2 mission, et cetera. It's where NASA needs to take that ownership of the technical design for that and work out that decadal survey, and then help present that to the community for more decadal survey process of buy-in, I think, Marcia.
Yeah, but I think that the big challenge is that how can you go to a transition team, whoever it is going to come into office and say, hey, we need to have a program to send people to Mars, when the community itself still has not agreed on the best way to achieve that. So I think that there's a lot of work that the community needs to do.
Even more basic, when the Apollo program did not stem from the space community deciding we want to go to the moon. I mean, it stemmed from a political imperative, and that's what we do not have for Mars. So my view in tying together these couple of questions, Mars needs to be more than a slogan. Journey to Mars, Mars matters, clap your hands, I believe. People are smarter than this. And my criticism is not that they don't have a direct plan, it's that they don't have the mandate or an explanation of why it matters that the public can relate to at this point. So back to your question, I know that the Obama administration is sort of tagged with, hey, we killed Moon, Mars, and beyond to go straight for Mars. Believe me, that was nobody's intent at the beginning, and I'm very, very sorry it appears to be that way. The agenda of ours was really to not choose a destination because, as Marsh said, there is no consensus, and I, like her, have been in these arguments for 30 years. I'm a loony, that's just known. But to really drive down the development costs and the operational cost, to drive down operational costs, so that when you have the geopolitical mandate to go, that would clearly come from both the administration and Congress, right? You need both. You can go within a time frame that they're going to allow you to do it. And I don't think that's 20 years.
Yeah. Mars is consistently in,
20 years
in
away.
authorization bills. Well, we were talking about horizon goals, okay? And so people like Tom Young, former Goddard director, looked at it and said, look at the amount of money you're going to be spending between here, roughly $9 billion a year. And you multiply that out times 20 years, and you're getting $180 billion. So you're getting around the ballpark to start thinking in these terms. But we can't start and stop the programs. It needs a
don't
long-term
have a
consistency. And the mere fact that we've had authorization legislation that has identified Mars as that horizon goal for the last 10 years is significant buy-in in the political class.
I think we've
realize
had
how we
Mars
get
as a horizon goal ever since we discovered it.
1996 space policy did away with Moon and Mars.
It's been a horizon.
The 1996 space policy did away with the goals of Moon and Mars. I defer to Marsh on that.
Let me just put my oar in the water here again. I just got back from Kent, Washington, where I spent 4 hours with Jeff Bezos and some of my colleagues explaining his space policy. It has very little to do with the space policy we're talking about right now. And he's actually doing something. I mean, he showed us rocket engines, and I was fascinated to find out that they've flown to suborbital space twice with the same vehicle without removing the engine, and they're about to do it again, maybe. Mary Lynn, let me ask you, how can the traditional community that I think we're all most familiar with accommodate the Jeff Bezoses and Elon Musk and other sort of non-traditional, sometimes called new space people?
So first of all, this is a really old story that goes on. It's been going on since the founding of the country, since before the founding of the country, and it's been going on way outside the space arena. I mean, this is not a new story, right? Where you have technologies or capabilities or engineering or ways of doing things that develop over some decades. They're used because they're tried and true, they work, there's a lot of investment in them, there are industry standards that develop, there's that whole thing that sort of grows up over time, they have a great deal of intrinsic value, and then the disruptor comes along, right? Or it's one disruptor or two disruptors or three disruptors, because technology changes or ways of doing processes change, or there's some sort of innovation, very often born of the work that's been done before, okay, that sort of plowed the ground for it. And when that disruption happens, it always shakes things up. And there's always resistance to it. And this has been going on, it's went on in the airline industry, I'm sure Larry can attest to it, it's been going on for a long time. So first of all, to recognize that that is what it is, and that's the nature of innovation and development and technical achievement, and that's not something to be afraid of. But there's inherent competition there, right? And so recognizing that the competition is there, if you're starting to think about mapping, let's say, space to go, the white space, that's a great expression, the white space between here and to go to Mars, Mars is really hard. One of the things of sitting around on the NRC committee for a year and a half, 2 years and a half, was sort of getting my arms around just how hard it was, and I've been in human spaceflight for 20 years. So really understanding how difficult it is. It's going to take everything we've got. If we're serious about doing it over some long period of time, it's going to take everything we've got. If you want to get massive payload off the ground, then you want a super heavy lifter. That's where SLS is. If you're interested in trying to protect people in deep space, okay, that's one of the things that Orion can do. If you're interested in using relatively heavy lifters, but maybe you want to go back and forth to the moon because you want to develop some stuff, perhaps that's where the Falcon Heavy comes in. If what you're interested in is flying reusables, maybe a great place to do reusables is actually in space, because in space, you know, have all the penalties that are involved when you're trying to take off from a gravity well all the time, bring it back and take it back and forth. So maybe in space is the place to use reusables. Point is, you have an architecture you have to develop over time, and you're going to need most of these things. And I think some of it is stop shooting inward and start thinking about what these capabilities actually are and what we might need. And if we were going to start planning several different scenarios, and now my strategic planning background will come to bear. If you're going to start planning certain scenarios and sort of trading them off, I think you're going to find that a lot of these capabilities are going to be useful at various points. So that would be my completely idealistic prescription, okay, for how it is that you would go forward, given how you think about this.
Jeff, I believe you have a...
reminded us about in terms of the ability to sustain shuttle and station over a number of administrations and Congresses. And there were ways that happened. It didn't happen by accident. And I think, you know, what it says to us is that we do have the opportunity to find a way forward. And I think, you know, both Marcia and Mary Lynn in the last two comments have kind of given a good scope of the vision for that. But I wanted to kind of set a little bit of a historical framework that I have, and then see if you think it's the wrong framework. Maybe correct a few things that I might disagree with as has been described. You know, beginning with 2004, after Columbia, we had the Bush announcement of the vision for space exploration. In 2005, the Congress took up the mantle of deciding to either adopt, moderate, or refuse that initiative, and they chose to adopt it with moderations in the 2005 Act. As Chris pointed out, that was sort of the beginning of what I would suggest was a sequence of 3 different bills which consistently argued the same position, of the horizon goal being Mars. And then we get into some of the means of doing that. And along the way, those legislative enactments also, by the way, were the reason we had the extension of station to 2020, and was required by both the House and Senate in their bills, and in the law as adopted. The AMS being put on station was required by Congress in the 2008 Act. The flight of STS-134 and 135 were required by Congress in the legislation, and you know, they were steps along the way to help make sure we got the foundation laid well for continuing the station as a platform to help expand the commercial opportunities for a long period of time to make it commercially viable. So I think it's important to point out too that what we chose to do in the Congress was to say, wherever the destination specific is, Moon, Mars, beyond, we need a heavy lift vehicle to get there. That was a choice we made, an informed choice to make that decision. And so we chose to adopt a capability focus. So wherever we're going to actually go, we need to have this vehicle. It's going to take us 5 to 10 years to build this vehicle, so let's get going. So that, I think, is what I would characterize as the congressional political consensus, because those bills were signed into law by presidents. And so that's where it has gotten us to this point. Now, I think we're on the verge of the kind of discussion that we're hearing here, which is what are the specific tools we're going to need to take up on those vehicles and continue on to actually go to those specific destinations. So is it, I guess my question is it generally understood that we have a consensus that has gotten us to this point? We've had a consensus that got us to this point. We now need to build the new consensus to go the next steps, to build upon that foundation to go the next steps to actually implement missions to these destinations.
Lori?
Wow, that's a great question. Let me just ask you real quick before you sit down, Jeff. Can I ask you a question, Jeff? So didn't Congress also require that SLS have its own capability to be back up for station transportation, and had some dates by which it had to meet certain milestones? Right, and is it? I mean, my point is, Congress, yes, you're right, they make statements, but they can't necessarily make it happen. Right, right. So that's the difficulty. Indeed. You need both. You need both. There isn't much question. And I guess on whether we have consensus now, clearly we have consensus that between Congress and this administration, we've managed the last few years to have, I think, the disagreements be about hundreds of millions instead of billions. So yeah, we recognize the administration's budgets do not fund the Hill's priorities as much as they would like. They add that money back for the most part, cut the other programs. The last budget, you know, each budget probably goes a little farther to consensus. The issue is for Moon, Mars, deep space exploration, elephant in the room, you need a heavy lift vehicle. Would you be spending the amount of money we are on that part of the architecture if you had it commercially available for pennies on the dollar? That's going to be the question. Falcon Heavy flies. Are you going to continue to invest taxpayer dollars that would take a large chunk of what you could be spending on lunar landers, transfer vehicles, and so forth? Not saying the answer to that. I think that will be something after Falcon Heavy has to fly, I think, before you really would start to consider that trade-off. But I can't imagine somebody is not going to raise that in the political world. 53?
53.
So first version of SLS will have 70 in it will have 70 years later than we have 50 something commercially for, let's see, how much did that cost the government? Oh yeah, nothing compared to 30 billion. A Falcon Heavy, the government's not paying for that. So, you know, we'll see. We'll see.
Chris, did you want to say something?
No, I'm going to go back to previous comment that this is why you need the Dan Bunbachers of the world who run the programmatics within NASA to make those to make the technical decisions like this, and for the policy people to take a step back.
Thanks.
Well, so I am just going to make my most controversial statement of the day. I think it's the opposite. So we have let the Dan Bunbachers of the world direct these programs, and that is why we have not reached consensus on a mandate. If we had a mandate and a public that said, yes, there is meaning to go back to the moon, to Mars, then I guarantee you these people are so brilliant, they could find the best way to do it. It shouldn't be finding the best way to do it that drives where we go or why. Within the government funding, it's just not the way it works. And I have so much confidence in the NASA and industry team that they will be able to deliver what we charge. I mean, that's what happened with Apollo. Give me something that we can win, and NASA was able to deliver. NASA didn't set its own goal.
Yeah, not talking about the policy, you know, what is the policy goal is the engineering design. Your discussion here of Falcon Heavy versus SLS, that technical capability, that is where engineering management is required. And policy people said, well, here's the goal. Tell us how you.
But again, that's a little bit of a socialist way of developing something. You know, the potatoes will be planted in March. We know that in a system of competition, what did Mary Lynn just talk about? Ways that things that come along, innovations that allow us to make different advancements. If we have an innovation that is not funded on the backs of taxpayers, that allows us to go farther for a lot less, don't we want to use it? Are we going to say, no, a program manager told me we needed this much then? I just don't think that we will, or that would be the most efficient way of really developing space.
There's a question right here. Let's take that one.
Actually, it was something that Lori brought up just a minute ago, was we don't have a mandate. And I would argue that because we don't have a good reason why we're sending people into deep space, not low Earth orbit, but deep space, that we've been, if you'll excuse the pun, going around in circles for however many years. And so I guess my question is, if you were king or queen for a day and you could make a mandate, why we should be sending people to Mars or an asteroid or the moon, or pick your favorite destination, what would it be?
You're asking me in particular?
No, let's.
Okay, so I'm going to give two answers, and neither one is probably entirely satisfactory. One of them is that when you peel back all of the reasons to go, for human beings to explore, it's not that there's a mandate, it's that there's multiple values associated with that. There's a bunch of different reasons to do that. When we push into frontiers we haven't pushed into before, we learn just a whole lot of stuff. We advance our technologies, we advance our knowledge set, we advance ourselves, we change our culture. History is full of it. And so stopping to sort of say, well, why are you going to explore? Why are you going to go into this very unforgiving environment? What's the mandate to go do it? Well, I could just look at all of human history and give you the mandate to go do it. If what you want is a political mandate, okay, then I think it's much more difficult to do, in part because of the fact that we're in a democratic system and there's a great deal of debate about it, and there are a range of values, that sort of value propositions that are associated with it. But that's not, I would say that stopping and saying, well, because we can't come to consensus, okay, on what the particular value proposition is that we're all going to rally around, and all you need to do is look at what's happening in the political environment right now to know that that's damn unlikely, almost depending on what you pick. It doesn't have to be space. Okay, if you don't, why is space held to this sort of standard that we have to come, somehow in this country, we have to come to some single consensus about what the mandate needs to be in order for us to go forward? We don't do that for almost anything else. So I guess I get lost in that argument. So what I would say is that there are an array of reasons to do it. Okay, some of them have to do with international relationships, some of them have to do with discovery, some of them have to do with the fact that we push technology and we learn a lot of things from it. Some of the things that we have to do, and what I was going to do was sort of comment to your comment earlier, Lori, that I don't think it's just a simple trade having to do with cost. Again, it has to do with what do you want to do with these things and what are the best tools to go do them, okay, depending on what it is that you want to go do, which goes back to your mandate question. Well, but the point is, pick a direction and go, right? We're saying that we want to go to Mars. There's consensus about the fact that you may disagree about the fact there's a political consensus to go, but there is a consensus. There's a sort of consensus, okay, to go. It's been written into law, okay, it's repeated, it shows up in the culture, whether it's being driven by an ad campaign or not, okay. If you go poll the public, what you find out is they're pretty interested in going to Mars. They don't know a damn thing about how hard it is, okay, or how much money it's going to cost, but they don't know how much an aircraft carrier costs either. All right, so I think that going forward shouldn't be stopped by the fact that there isn't necessarily going to be a consensus about the mandate.
So understanding that, I think that my next kind of follow-on to that would be a reason good enough to convince the public that they should spend a significant fraction of $1 trillion, be it over a quarter of a century. That is the political sustainability that I think is lacking. So that's, and I'll take it down.
NASA was funded at $19.3 billion. This is one of the highest appropriations in the history of NASA. There is a sentiment that that people are willing to spend, especially in a multi-trillion-dollar government budget, $14 trillion economy annually, is that the spending on for NASA and R&D in general is a qualitative judgment. I've had this discussion with various House leadership policymakers on this, is that a dollar spent on NASA or NIH research or some Department of Energy programs, this is a worthwhile investment that's not qualitatively the same as Social Security.
Sandy?
Yeah, so to kind of bring this full circle, if we sit around and we wait for a political mandate a la Kennedy, we are never going to go anywhere because it's not likely. We as a community have to take responsibility for we as a community moving space forward, and we have to build, back to where we started, a consensus around what we're going to do as a community, how we want to achieve it, and it has to be informed by strategy that talks about how we want to develop technologies, where we want the ownership of technologies, what we want to develop as capability for the United States, and we have to continue to point out the benefits that come from doing activities in space, whether that's human or robotic or science, earth science, or planetary exploration, or whatever. And we have to continue working together as a community to do this, because we have to sort of lead ourselves, guys. We can't look outside for somebody to come wave a magic wand and suddenly appreciate everything that we're doing. We know the things that we're doing are important. We know the benefits from the things that we're doing, and we have to continue to communicate those and we have to continue to work towards this consensus and maintain it. And I love, Mary Lynn, that language about don't shoot inward, because that is the worst thing we can do as a community. Yeah, I understand the power of disruption. I think there's a lot of great things going on in the industry right now to sort of refresh us and get everybody thinking, but that doesn't mean chew ourselves up from within. That means we have to work together to figure out how to make this. And yeah, it's not easy. Yeah, it's ugly. Yeah, it's going to be hard, but that's what we have to do, because we're not going to get a mandate. We are not.
Marcia?
There was a comment about how you're going to get the public to agree and everything. And Mary Lynn, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I read the NRC Pathways report, because they really looked at this issue of public support, and the answer was that the public will support whatever Washington decides it wants to do. It's not going to go out and try to make a change. It's going to do whatever it wants. It's going to follow the leadership of the policymakers and politicians in Washington. And so it puts it all in the lap of the politicians and policymakers in Washington, which is why I feel it's up to the community to at least come together on what they want in order to convince that small group of people, because the rest of the American public is waiting to be told what it is we're going to do. And I say this only slightly tongue-in-cheek, and I'll probably get yelled at for it, but it is true that I think that the message that appeals to Americans on this is to make America great again.
And yeah, and Marcia, I agree, because every time I go talk to the public, they are excited about what we're doing in space. Whatever it is that you bring to their attention, they are proud of it, they're excited, they love it, they really appreciate what you guys are doing, what we are doing in this room.
You've been
Whatever
very
it is.
patient.
Hi, I'm Steve Leadham here at NASA Goddard. I think one topic that kind of illustrates the difference between a NASA-led concept for how to do human exploration and maybe a politically led one can be illustrated with the example of nuclear power in space. So I listened to Harley Thronson's Future in Space Operations things, and I think about what Zubrin had as his plan for how to go to Mars efficiently. And nuclear power in the form of nuclear rockets and in generating propellant on the surface of Mars by using a lot of power to turn carbon dioxide and a little bit of hydrogen into rocket fuel. These are things that are enabled by nuclear power. NASA doesn't do nuclear power. Therefore, neither of those things is in the NASA human exploration plans. And so we end up with an inefficient plan because we're not using technology that is somebody else's job. But if a political leadership from outside could put those things together and say, you generate the nuclear power plants that can go in space, you, NASA, do the rest of it, and we'll all work together within the government and industry. So I was wondering if I could just throw that out for you guys to chew on a little bit.
I agree. I think it is about leadership, and the consensus needs to be, again, something that while we in the community are going to develop, I think, Marcia, I agree, the core of it, it does need to be something that resonates. And I'm not sure we've answered your question well. For me, again, Mars as the next destination is not where I think the best value is. I long-term believe, of course, that for sustainability of humanity, we're exploring and evolving into space. I am simpatico with Mike Griffin on that, let it be said. It's just ultimately, if that is your goal, you might do it in a way that is less flags and footsteps than really going to stay. And being able to leave behind a better planet, a more informed planet, a more enlightened planet, that has more in the U.S. now, because you bet, America, what's I don't even know a slogan. Make America great again. Okay, so I'll argue we are great. We are awesome, America, as well as NASA. I never shoot in. My pilots believe I am the biggest space fanatic of all time, and you're right, it is extremely popular with everyone. But we really leave behind a economy, a set of knowledge base, and that I think is the value that we should truly connect with. And if we're going to have a program that does that, you'd do it probably in a different way.
How are we doing on time? Okay. Here's one person who hasn't had anything to say yet.
So my question would be, I'm a law student. Everyone in this room beat me in math class. Nobody has discussed the populism elephant in the room. Especially after last night, if we have President Trump or President Sanders, and the pitchforks come for the discretionary spending, such as NASA. Are things like SpaceX, Blue Origin, can they do it alone right now? From the outside looking in, I would say no, but
I don't sense that either, any of the candidates, frankly, would have a radical space program that would zero NASA. I don't see that as an agency that Trump has ever said that about. And while he said we need to have our roads and bridges before going to Mars, he absolutely is going to support an agency that delivers an array of science and inspiration, an ability to employ people in high technology jobs, and yes, there'll probably be more focus on commercial, and that may or may not, for some of you, be a good thing immediately, but long term, it's a good thing.
well, so to that point, would it be not necessarily zeroing out NASA, but if they said we're going to significantly cut these, so like SpaceX, I would assume, or Blue Origin gets significant government funding at the moment. If they were to say we're going to cut that dramatically because we want the commercial entities to do it all on their own, is that feasible now? Will it ever be feasible?
Well, so, it makes choices tougher. I think it's unfortunate that where we are, while there might be consensus, we're doing a lot of things probably not as well as we could have. So that would require prioritization, and you would have to double down. I know we do love all our children. I could pick right now, just saying. It's been one of those days.
Chris.
With mine.
Okay, well, in the case of launch vehicles, government is just a customer. So if you're in business, you're going, okay, a customer is going to be changing his portfolio a bit, so I'll have to change mine in the process. For them, they have to make the call of like, okay, I'll be launching, Intelsat and SES rocket, payloads as well as government payloads. So that's in their business mix. Is it sustainable? That's up for them, not for the government to decide. I just want to go back to nuclear power propulsion. It definitely solves a lot of engineering problems to have that capability going forward. But again, I'll let program managers within the agency go, okay, this is where the design choice is here, and how to do that, and let policymakers step away from it. But they have a good working relationship with the Department of Energy on that. And the House passed a bill last week to help NASA and Department of Energy along in nuclear power R&D. So.
I think, as expected, this has been a lively discussion, and the clock on the wall says it's time to go. So I ask if we give our panelists a nice round of applause. Thank you all so much. I think there's probably more of one today than there was a while back. It has evolved, and what I would like to do is, in the next hour and a half or so, to talk about how that consensus can be refined, evolved, and continue without a dramatic disruption, if in fact that's what the space community wants. We have a really sterling panel to address these issues, and you know all of them, but I'm going to introduce them a little bit. Marcia Smith, right here on my left, is the president of the Space and Technology Policy Group and editor of the invaluable website spacepolicyonline.com, which I look at every single day. And I've trusted Marcia as an honest broker in space policy issues since the 1970s. I started calling her when I was still working in Alabama. And back in those days, she was advising lawmakers and tutoring ignorant reporters like me for the Congressional Research Service. Lori Garver needs no introduction, I'm sure. She's the general manager of the Airline Pilots Association, but we all know her as President Obama's deputy NASA administrator and the point person for the policy changes that issued from his White House. I think that's fair. Lori was certainly the one that I covered when I was writing about those changes. She's been a Washington-based policy, space policy, I have the word wonk here, I'll say expert instead. Maven. I like it too. So our Maven, since the early 80s, she served as executive director of the National Space Society for 9 years. She advised Hillary Clinton on space issues before the 2008 elections, and has worked space policy on President Obama's transition team. Chris Shank, next down the row, is the policy director for the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and a key advisor to the committee's chairman, Representative Lamar Smith of Texas. He was director of strategic investments at NASA and special assistant to Administrator Michael Griffin on human spaceflight and earth science issues. And like them, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of people, including, I suspect, practically everybody in this room, including me, who make their living from the space program, and so it's important to us. The fact that it wasn't a big deal, it isn't a big deal now, isn't that unusual either. I think we can all remember 8 years ago that it also didn't really come up on the map in the debates leading into the current presidential administration and all the other offices that went along with it. And the difference, I think, this year and 8 years ago is probably one of tone. I think before it was issues of the economy, war and peace, and now it has to do with, if I may, the size of body parts. So that's a shame, I think. But the U.S. space program, by extension that of much of the rest of the world, given the relative size of the U.S. space economy, is just getting into some really interesting places. Some really exciting new stuff is going on. And it's kind of shaken out, and things are happening that a lot of people, and some of them sitting at this table, I think would like to see continue. There's a clear understanding among many in the space community, industry, advocates, interested citizens who are sometimes dismissed as enthusiasts, but they are taxpayers, that another reset of the space policy that we've sort of evolved into could be disastrous. Earlier this month, there was about a baker's dozen very disparate space groups who got together and called for a more coherent transition, maybe a way to put it. And one of those groups was the AAS, the American Astronautical Society, and they gave this panel the title, Evolution of a Space Policy, How to Achieve Consensus. And you know, I'm not sure that there is a complete consensus today.
Our next panel is Evolution of a Space Policy, How to Achieve Consensus. Our moderator is Frank Mooring, who I know all of you know, but I'm going to say a few things anyway, okay? He's senior editor at Aviation Week in Space Technology and has been a journalist for 40 years, specializing in aerospace for over 20 years. He joined Aviation Week in 1989 as a defense space reporter and senior space technology editor. He began his career working for his hometown daily in Huntsville, Alabama, and moved to Washington in 1979 as correspondent for the Birmingham Post-Herald. He later covered the Cold War Pentagon for Scripps Howard News Service. Please join me in welcoming Frank.
Thank you, Lynn. And why don't the rest of the panel just come on up and we'll get started. I'm going to try to keep this kind of informal if we can and do questions and answers, and I hope that y'all have lots of them. You know, it's a leap year. I guess y'all noticed a couple of weeks ago that we we got an extra day. And of course, that means that it's time for the Summer Olympics and also for the presidential elections. You probably heard about that too. And, you know, presidential politics all tend to overwhelm the broader elections. This year there's all the seats in the House, a third of the Senate, and about a dozen governor's mansions are also up. And as usual, space exploration is not really getting a whole lot of attention right now in the broader political environment. And that's, to me, that's kind of surprising. You know, space, by one count, is a $330 billion a year industry internationally. That's a lot of money, I think. I'm not sure. Laurie, he's played a key role in formulating U.S. space policy at NASA and on the Hill. And he's also a former Air Force officer with duty time in the Pentagon, NRO, and the Air Force Space Command. Sandy Magnus, next down, is Executive Director of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics and a 3-time space shuttle astronaut. She spent 4.5 months on the space station as a member of Expedition 18 in 2008-2009. And as such, she was off the planet during the early transition from President George W. Bush's space policy to the current policy under President Obama. She's taken a very proactive role at AIAA in ensuring that space professionals are represented, that the space professionals represented by AIAA have a strong voice in the transition ahead. And finally, last but not least, Mary Lynn Dittmar is the Executive Director of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, which is an industry group set up to promote U.S. space leadership. She has a long career as a consultant to defense, aerospace, and technology companies on public-private partnership, strategy, and outreach. She was a member of the National Research Council Committee for Human Spaceflight, and as such, she helped draft the NRC's Pathways to Exploration report in 2014. So as you can see, the panel's well qualified to explore what it will take to evolve the space policy we have today into the future with minimum disruption, I hope, from the shifts in the broader political priorities as they evolve through the decades ahead. I'd like for this to be a discussion, as I said, so I'm going to ask some questions, but I really hope you guys do, because I don't have enough to fill up an hour and a half, no matter how long these guys talk. And with that, I'm going to kick it off with Sandy. And you know, you were part of the group the coalition of groups that talked about the need for a smooth transition and to get the space policy issues into the election at some level. I wonder if you could walk us through the motivation behind that work, give us an idea of how hard it was to reach agreement among those groups, and tell us how you and your colleagues hope to proceed in this election year.
Yeah, so it all started last summer, I guess. I don't remember the exact month, but the Space Foundation, AAS, AIAA, AIA, and pardon me, CSF. Sorry, I'm like totally losing my mind here after lunch. We all started talking together and about the election, because we all worry about transitions. If you look at the history of the space program, especially, it seems like every 2, 4, 6 years there's another turn in the road where we're going this way and then we're going that way, then we're going this way, and that's, as you know, not healthy for us, because we need long-term commitments. We need a plan that spans more than 2 or 4 or 6 years. And looking around the industry and looking at all the great things that are coming to fruition now after many years of a lot of work so in the back rooms, and we know there's been a lot of hard work going on. We are the people who are doing the work. We know the engineering is coming to fruition. We know the manufacturing is coming to fruition. We know we're about to enter into this really exciting phase where there are things launching all over the place, which is really when the rest of the world tends to pay attention to what's going on in space, is when you have a lot of things launching. And so knowing that there was some great momentum out there, and the difficulties that can come with the transition, we really got together to see if we could find across this very broad group of people and organizations, even though we had some overlapping members amongst all 5 of us. It really our membership spanned the whole industry. If we could as a group of 5 dispersed organizations find some intersection, the intersection of the Venn diagram, if you will, where we all agreed on things that were important to continue or points that we wanted to make that were important about the space program, that we could present as a broad coalition, inviting other groups in as we got the basics set. If we could do that and show there was a broad consensus from the community about, hey, this is really what we think is important about space. This is a really broad consensus from industry about what's really important about space, that it would minimize the disruptions of